I've been behind the wheel for 14 years now, the last 8 of them as an owner-operator with my own 2018 Freightliner Cascadia. When you spend that much time on the road, the cab becomes your only real home, and the asphalt feels like an extension of your own circulatory system. I know the sound of my engine at every RPM, I know every vibration of the air ride suspension, and I can tell by the slightest bit of resistance in the steering wheel if a trailer tire has lost 5 pounds of pressure. But that November night on I-80 in Nebraska, all my professional experience and my lauded rationality crumbled to dust when faced with something that couldn't be explained by the laws of physics or the rules of the road. It all started at an agricultural equipment distribution center near Omaha. It was nearing 9 p.m. The weather was classic late autumn Nebraska, raw and miserable, with low leaden clouds, a biting ice-cold wind sweeping off the prairies, and a temperature plummeting well below freezing. My load was perfect in every respect: heavy cast iron valves for irrigation systems and hydraulic pumps in massive wooden crates. 18 pallets, weighing exactly 42,000 pounds. This was dead, static weight. It doesn't slosh like liquid in a tanker, it doesn't sway like carcasses in a reefer, and it doesn't require temperature control. You load it, secure it, close the doors, and forget about it until delivery. I stood on the loading dock in my high-visibility vest, supervising. The forklift operator placed the pallets in a standard weight distribution pattern, strictly centered over the axles to avoid overloading the tractor's drive axles or the trailer's tandem. We cranked down every pallet to the floor with heavy-duty 5-inch nylon ratchet straps, and installed steel load bars between the rows, biting into the corrugated aluminum walls of the trailer. When we finished, you could have flipped a tractor inside that 53-foot trailer, and not a single crate would have shifted a millimeter. The warehouse shift manager walked down to the rear doors with me. We slammed the heavy doors shut, slid the locking bars into place, and he handed me a high-security bolt seal, a heavy-duty metal pin with the unique laser-etched number 4892K. We snapped the seal onto the right door's hasp together. I tugged on it to verify it was locked, wrote the number down on my log, and signed the bill of lading. From that moment on, the trailer was officially a sealed environment. You can only remove such a seal with heavy-duty bolt cutters or an angle grinder at the recipient's warehouse in Denver. If the seal is broken or damaged in transit, the insurance is voided, the load is rejected, and the driver faces a criminal investigation for suspected theft. I pulled onto I-80 around 10 p.m. and headed west toward North Platte. The first few hours were absolute, soothing routine. I cleared the state weigh station near Grand Island. The scales showed perfect weight distribution: 12,000 pounds on the steer axle, 34,000 on the drives, and 34,000 on the tandems. No overloads, everything legal. I set the cruise control to 65 miles per hour, poured myself some bitter, strong coffee from my thermos, and tuned the CB radio to channel 19. The airwaves were silent, save for the occasional pop of static and the weary chatter of 2 cattle haulers discussing diesel prices in Wyoming. By 2 a.m., the highway was utterly dead. Nebraska at night is a peculiar test of sanity. There are no hills, no forests, no curves for the eyes to latch onto. Just an absolutely straight, infinite gray ribbon of concrete leading into the void, and black fields on both sides that bled into the night sky. The monotonous hum of tires on expansion joints, the rhythmic hiss of the turbo, and the warmth from the heater began to induce that dangerous state of highway hypnosis, where the brain shuts off peripheral vision and the white dashed lines start to look like a solid stream of water jetting straight into the windshield. It was exactly 2:40 a.m. I was crossing the 212-mile marker near Gothenburg. The road was bone dry, the wind outside had died down, and there was neither moon nor stars in the sky, just a thick, low cloud cover reflecting the yellow light of my own headlamps. The cab smelled of cold coffee, dust from the AC, and heated plastic from the dashboard. I was holding the wheel calmly with one hand, staring into the darkness ahead. And then, the trailer shifted. It wasn't a sharp jolt from a crosswind gust. With wind, the tractor and trailer tilt in unison, and you feel the pressure across the entire surface area. It wasn't a tire blowout. A blowout sounds like a gunshot, and the wheel immediately pulls to one side. This was a heavy, dull, localized shift of weight inside the trailer itself. As if something weighing several tons had slowly rolled from the left wall of the trailer to the right. My cab was softly but perceptibly pulled to the side through the fifth wheel kingpin, the trailer's rear springs let out a long, strained groan, and the truck lost its perfect trajectory for a second. I instantly dropped the throttle and grabbed the wheel with both hands, straightening the rig. My pulse spiked, and the drowsiness vanished instantly. My rational brain immediately kicked into gear, searching for a logical explanation. A strap, I thought. One of the nylon bands must have frayed against a sharp cast iron edge if the forklift driver forgot to place a plastic corner protector. The strap snapped under tension, one of the half-ton crates shifted a couple of inches and hit the next pallet. It was annoying, it could mean a fine at the next scale house, but it was physically explainable. I decided to push on for another 15 miles to the next rest area near Kozad to stop under the lights and check the load through the inspection hatch, or at least assess the sidewall geometry. I dropped my speed to 50 miles per hour, watching the truck's behavior closely in the mirrors. In the red glow of my taillights, the long white wall of the trailer looked completely normal. No tilting. For minutes later, exactly at the 216-mile marker, it happened again. This time, the shift wasn't lateral, it was longitudinal. I felt a sharp, heavy thump right into the back of my seat, as if the load inside the trailer had moved from the rear doors forward, to the very head of the trailer, slamming into the front wall. The force of the impact made the tractor's rear suspension dip, and the airbags loudly bled off excess air, PSSHTist. The CB radio jumped in its mount, and some coffee sloshed out of my cup holder. That was when I truly started to feel uneasy. Cast iron valves weighing 40,000 pounds don't fly back and forth inside a trailer on a flat road at a constant speed. For that kind of momentum, I would have had to slam on the brakes with all my might or hit a concrete wall. But I was on a perfectly flat, level stretch on cruise control. Maybe all the load bars snapped at once? I speculated frantically, feeling cold sweat creeping down my neck. If the crates broke loose from the straps, they're balling across the floor now. If they punch through the sidewall at speed, I'm going into the ditch. I flipped on the right blinker and began to pull onto the shoulder, short of the rest area. Up ahead, about 5 miles away, I saw an old gravel turnout for emergency stops, unlit and completely empty. I braked, pulled the wheels onto the gravel, and engaged the tractor and trailer parking brakes. The heavy yellow and red buttons on the dash popped out with a loud clack, dumping air from the brake chambers. Silence filled the cab, broken only by the quiet, steady rumble of the diesel at idle and the ticking of the cooling exhaust pipe. I threw on my winter jacket, donned my high-vis vest, and grabbed my heavy aluminum mag light and my tire thumper, the wooden mallet we used to check tire pressure. I opened the door and jumped down to the ground. The freezing air hit my lungs like ice water. It was about 15 degrees Fahrenheit, around -9 Celsius, outside. A deep, ringing silence hung over the Nebraska night. There wasn't a single headlight in either direction on the highway as far as the eye could see. Just the black horizon and the ice-cold wind rustling the dry, frozen grass in the ditch. It smelled of frozen earth, my truck's diesel exhaust, and ozone from the cooling brake drums. I walked around the front of the tractor, thumping the tires, thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound was sharp and taut. All tires held pressure. I walked along the left side of the trailer, shining my light on the aluminum skin. No dents, no bulges. The springs and rubber airbags looked fine. I reached the rear doors and aimed the beam at the lock. Bolt seal 4892K was right where it should be. The pin was intact, the lock untouched, there wasn't even a fresh scratch on the metal. The trailer was hermetically sealed. No one had opened those doors since I left Omaha. I stood by the rear end, shining the light on the rusty hinges, and at that moment, the wind died down for a second. In the absolute silence that followed, I heard a sound coming from inside the sealed trailer. It wasn't the sound of a falling crate or a rolling piece of metal. It was a slow, rhythmic, raspy friction sound. As if something very heavy, yet soft, was slowly dragging itself across the wooden floorboards. *SHRRRKH, pause. *SHRRRKH, pause. The sound was coming from the center of the trailer toward the rear doors, 2 meters away from where I stood. I froze, holding my breath. My hand tightened around the mallet so hard my knuckles turned white. Then, something else was added to the dragging sound. It was breathing. But not the breathing of a man or a beast. It was the sound of massive blacksmith's bellows drawing air in and pushing it out within a confined, hollow space. Whoa! The aluminum trailer walls, only a few millimeters thick, acted like the diaphragm of a giant speaker. I physically felt the low-frequency vibration through the soles of my boots. My brain, trained by years of technical maintenance, desperately clung to straws of rationality. Thermal expansion. I screamed to myself. The air inside was warm when it was loaded in Omaha. Now it's freezing outside. The metal is contracting, the wooden floor is deforming from the temperature swing, and the air inside is condensing, creating a vacuum, making the walls groan and pop. It's simple physics. Metal fatigue. I stepped right up to the rear doors and placed my palm against the icy metal of the right door, right next to the seal. The metal was freezing. I listened. Inside the trailer, right on the other side of the door, 10 centimeters from my face, the dragging stopped. A heavy, wet thud followed, as if a giant hand, covered in something sticky and dense, had pressed against the inside of the door. The door panel shuddered almost imperceptibly under my hand. The metal beneath my palm began to heat up rapidly. Within 5 seconds, the cold steel turned warm, then hot, as if a heater had been pressed against the door from the inside. I pulled my hand away as if burned and stumbled back, slipping on the frozen gravel. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, hitting the side of the trailer. And what I saw made my stomach turn into an ice-cold knot. The aluminum sidewall of the 53-foot trailer, designed for rigid support, was slowly, pulsatingly bulging outward before my eyes. Right in the center of the trailer body, 5 feet off the floor, the metal was swelling by an inch or two, making the rivets pop with a dry, sharp sound, pop, pop, pop. It was as if inside the trailer there wasn't static cast iron, but a giant lung that was inflating, trying to burst its hermetic aluminum shell. I didn't go check the right side. I didn't shout or bang on the side with my mallet. A primal, animal terror gripped me, the kind that shuts down all logic and leaves only one reflex: run. I sprinted for the cab, nearly dropping the flashlight, flew up the steps, slammed the door, and instantly hit the lock buttons. I punched the yellow and red parking brake buttons, the air hissed into the lines, releasing the brakes. I slammed it into 4th gear and dumped the clutch, flooring it. The 15-ton rig lurched off the gravel shoulder onto the asphalt of I-80, drive tires spinning and leaving a trail of black smoke from the stack. I drove at the engine's absolute limit. 80 miles per hour, 85. The engine roared at 3,000 revolutions per minute, the turbo screaming like a siren. I couldn't tear my eyes off the mirrors. In the glow of the taillights, I saw the trailer behind me behaving unnaturally. It wasn't just rolling on its suspension, it was rhythmically shuddering on the perfectly flat asphalt. Every 40 seconds, the rear tandem would be jolted a couple of inches upward, then slammed down with force, as if whatever was inside had started to jump or walk with a heavy, measured stride across the wooden floor from the walls to the center. I grabbed the CB mic, flipped to the emergency channel, then back to 19, any rig on I-80 near the 220-mile marker east of North Platte. Is anyone hearing me? I have load issues. Over. Only hissing, dull white noise came through the speaker. But through that noise, on the very edge of perception, I heard that same rhythmic, heavy breathing. It wasn't coming from the CB radio. It was coming from behind me, through the thin aluminum partition of the sleeper cab, through the 5 feet of open space between the tractor and the front wall of the trailer. It was syncing with my engine RPM. Every 10 seconds, the rear wall of my cab gave a quiet, metallic click, as if someone outside, on the front wall of the trailer, were softly tapping with their knuckles, tap, tap, tap. I made it to the 24-hour Love's truck stop on the outskirts of North Platte by 3:30 a.m. I tore into the brightly lit lot in front of the fuel pumps, braking so hard the tires smoked, and stopped right under the massive halogen lights of the canopy, next to 3 other rigs whose drivers were peacefully fueling up. I tumbled out of the cab on jelly legs, breathing hard, soaked in cold sweat. The truck stop lights looked like the most beautiful sight on earth. An old cattle hauler driver who had been fueling his Peterbilt next to me walked over immediately. He looked at my pale face, then shifted his gaze to my trailer, and let out a low whistle. "Hey, buddy. Where'd you manage to bend the frame like that? Your floor is about to fall out to hell. What are you hauling, lead blocks you dropped in the center?" I walked to the trailer. Under the bright lights, it was clearly visible, the heavy longitudinal steel I-beams of the frame beneath the trailer floor, designed to carry tens of tons, were bowed downward right in the middle of the trailer. The sag was about 3 inches. 42,000 pounds of weight had inexplicably shifted off the axles and concentrated in one single point in the center of the wooden floor, occupying an area of no more than a square foot. And while the old-timer and I stared at the bowed metal, a quiet, wet sound of a sigh came from inside the trailer. The steel frame beneath the floor began to straighten out before our eyes, slowly, with a screech and a grind, rising back up until it was perfectly horizontal, as it should be. It was as if that invisible, incredibly heavy creature that had been standing in the center of the trailer had slowly stepped from the floor onto the load bars closer to the walls, redistributing its weight back over the axles. The old cattle hauler backed away toward his truck in silence, hung up the fuel nozzle, climbed into his cab, and drove off without even putting his fuel cap back on. He knew the golden rule of old-school truckers: if someone else's trailer starts living its own life, don't ask questions and get as far away as possible. I sat in the brightly lit truck stop diner until dawn, drinking 2 liters of coffee, unable to bring myself to even approach the truck. At 8 a.m., I arrived at the delivery terminal in Denver. When the receivers came out with the bolt cutters, I stood 30 feet away from the doors. They cut bolt seal 4892K. It was completely intact. They threw the rear doors open, and we looked inside. All 18 wooden crates with the cast iron equipment were sitting exactly where the forklift driver had placed them in Omaha. Not a single pallet had shifted a millimeter. There wasn't a speck of dust on the floor to suggest movement. But when the receiver climbed inside to check the labels, he called me over. I climbed into the trailer, feeling my insides freeze. Each of the 18 5-inch nylon straps, rated for 10 tons of tensile strength, had been thinned in the center to the consistency of transparent spiderwebs. The synthetic fibers had been melted by colossal friction, as if the crates had been ripped off the floor by a hydraulic jack, but the straps had miraculously held. And in the very center of the trailer, right between the 9th and 10th pallets, in a narrow 2-foot wide aisle, the 1.5-inch oak floorboards had been crushed into the metal frame. There was a perfectly smooth, oval-shaped depression in the wood, 3 centimeters deep and 3 feet long. The indentation smelled of ozone, stagnant swamp water, and something animalistic, old, and cold. The receiver silently scratched his head, wrote "floor deformation due to wood wear" in the report, and signed my bill. I didn't argue with him. I unloaded, got paid, and sold that trailer for pennies at a lot in Denver that very same day, buying myself a new one with thick, reinforced walls. Since then, I never take sealed, blind trailers on night hauls through Nebraska. If I'm hauling a load, I have to be able to open an inspection hatch or see through a curtain side to know exactly what's lying behind my back. Because when you're driving down a lonely highway at 2 in the morning, with nothing but the black void of the prairie around you, the scariest thing isn't ice on the road or a sleepy oncoming driver. The scariest thing is the realization that behind that bolt seal from Omaha, you are hauling something across the country for which 42,000 pounds of cast iron are nothing but children's toys in its dark, locked cage. Before we move on to the next story, I'd be very grateful if you could write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious to see how far these stories travel. It also helps the channel grow because it shows YouTube that these videos are worth recommending. And if you're already enjoying the atmosphere, feel free to support the video with a like. Alright, let's continue. When you haul high-margin cargo, pharmaceuticals, biochemicals, or precision medical equipment, your job as a truck driver stops being just about driving a truck. You become an operator of a mobile safe on wheels. My rig is a Volvo VNL 860 with a high-roof sleeper, and behind me, I pull a 53-foot Thermo King reefer, packed to the gills with electronics. Per the requirements of the insurance company and federal freight safety regulations for loads worth $3 million or more, my trailer is equipped with an autonomous, high-resolution 4-channel video surveillance system. 3 cameras monitor the perimeter, left side, right side, and the rear gate area, including the locks. The 4th camera is a wide-angle infrared dome module mounted right at the ceiling inside the trailer, against the front bulkhead, aimed down the entire cargo bay toward the rear doors. The feed from all these cameras is displayed on a 10-inch touchscreen monitor integrated into my cab center console, right above the ELD, the electronic logging device. That night, I was transiting from Kansas City to Denver on Interstate 70. Inside the trailer was a shipment of temperature-sensitive vaccine components. The temperature requirements were strict, 4 degrees Celsius. A deviation of even 2 degrees for 30 minutes would lead to the total disposal of the cargo and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. The refrigeration unit on the front wall of the trailer hummed rhythmically, pushing icy air through the canvas duct running along the ceiling. By 2:40 a.m., my ELD began its relentless countdown of my remaining legal driving time. Federal law is unforgiving. Once the 11-hour limit is up, you are required to take a 10-hour, uninterrupted break in sleeper berth mode, or face fines, a loss of safety rating, and disciplinary action from dispatch. I was in the heart of western Kansas, not far from the town of Wakini. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Sleet mixed with snow was lashing the windshield, the asphalt was glazing over with a thin, treacherous layer of black ice, and gusts of wind whipping across the open prairies were shoving the truck from side to side. I pulled into a state rest area at the 290-mile marker. It was a bleak, windswept spot, miles away from any sign of civilization. The only lighting was around a small brick restroom building, while the massive truck parking lot was swallowed by impenetrable, damp darkness. There were only 2 other rigs in the lot, an old Freightliner at the far end and a hopper-bottom grain hauler near the exit. Both cabs were dark, their drivers long asleep behind drawn curtains. I carefully parked my rig in the center row, killed the truck's main engine, and switched on the autonomous Webasto diesel heater, the bunk heater. The familiar soft clicking of the fuel pump and the warm hiss of air from the vents quickly filled the cab with comfort. I logged my status as sleeper on the ELD, pulled the heavy, multi-layered thermal curtains across the windshield and side windows, and then drew the thick corded curtain separating the driver's station from the sleeper berth. The cab became an isolated, warm cocoon, protected from the Kansas blizzard raging outside. I heated up a can of beef stew on a portable 12-volt stove, brewed some tea, and took a habitual glance at the 10-inch surveillance monitor before climbing into my bunk. The screen glowed with a 4-window grid, Channel 1, left side, empty wet asphalt, beginning to frost over, Channel 2, right side, dry brush shaking in the wind, Channel 3, rear doors, the heavy abloy padlock and the numbered tamper-evident seal with its laser barcode, hanging motionless. Channel 4 showed the interior of the trailer in a monochrome, green and black infrared spectrum. 24 pallets, tightly wrapped in white stretch film with the pharmaceutical company's logos, stood in perfect, even rows under the cold light of the IR LEDs. Everything was calm, static, and secure. I turned off the main light, leaving only the small LED reading lamp at the head of the bed, climbed into my sleeping bag, and opened my book. On the other side of the cab wall, the four-cylinder diesel reefer hummed a monotonous, lulling tune, maintaining those 4 degrees inside the trailer. Outside, the wind howled through the radio antennas with a long, mournful moan. It was exactly 3:10 a.m. when a sharp, short beep from the onboard surveillance system pulled me from my half-sleep. Beep beep. That signal meant the software motion detector had tripped on one of the channels. Usually, it's nothing, a large drop of rain or a snowflake sticking to an exterior camera lens, or the headlights of a passing car throwing a sharp shadow on the asphalt near the side of the truck. With a sigh, I put the book aside, pulled back the sleeping compartment curtain, and looked at the center console. Channels 1, 2, and 3 were quiet. No movement outside. But on Channel 4, inside the sealed, airtight trailer, a yellow detector box was flashing. It was hovering over the top of the third pallet from the rear doors, at the very end of the 53-foot corridor. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. In infrared monochrome, the image has a specific sharpness. Warm objects look white or bright green, while cold objects fall into the darkness. I watched the third pallet for a minute. Nothing moved. The boxes stood like a solid wall, the stretch film pulling smooth across the cardboard. My rational brain, honed by years of working with sensitive equipment, instantly offered a logical explanation: thermodynamics and optics. When the Thermo King reefer switches to an active cooling cycle, the powerful evaporator fans blast a jet of cold air near the ceiling. When it meets the warmer air near the walls, microscopic swirls of condensation form, or the air density shifts, which can cause a momentary refractive distortion on an IR matrix. Or, even simpler, the vibration of the running trailer engine caused a small tail of packing tape on a box to peel off and tremble in the airflow from the fan, causing the pixels on the screen to change contrast. I pressed the reset button on the touch screen, returned to my bunk, closed the curtain, and turned off the reading light. Only the faint, greenish glow of the ELD indicators remained in the dark cab. At 3:35 a.m., the monitor buzzer chirped again. This time, it was more persistent: beep beep beep. Fatigue and irritation are poor counselors, but when your mandatory sleep is interrupted, you feel nothing but anger at the imperfection of cheap sensors. I kicked off the sleeping bag, climbed into the driver's seat in just my thermal underwear, and pressed my face right up to the 10-inch screen. The yellow motion detector box on Channel 4 was active again. But now the image had changed in a way that replaced my anger with a cold, prickly sense of alarm. In the narrow vertical gap between the fourth and fifth pallets from the rear doors, where there is usually 15 to 20 centimeters of space for air circulation, a thermal anomaly had appeared. In infrared, it looked like a dense, vertical strip of absolute black, a shadow spot absorbing IR radiation. It was about 2 meters tall but unnaturally narrow, as if a person had sucked in their gut, pressed their arms to their sides, and squeezed their shoulders together to fit into the gap between 2 giant cubes of vaccine boxes. Foil or insulation peeling away from the side, I began to reason frantically, feeling goosebumps crawl up the back of my neck. Pharmaceutical packaging often uses metallized thermal film. If a box got crushed during the ride, a piece of foil could have poked into the aisle and is now acting like a mirror, reflecting the cold floor and creating the illusion of a black void on the IR camera. I didn't take my eyes off the screen for 5 long minutes. The black strip between the pallets didn't tremble in the air like tape or foil. It began to move with a terrifying, mechanical smoothness. The top part of this 2-meter shadow slowly, millimeter by millimeter, leaned forward out of the gap into the central aisle between the rows of pallets. The lean was about 10 degrees. The shadow froze in that position for exactly 60 seconds. It was as if someone tall and impossibly thin had carefully poked their head around the corner of the box to look toward the camera lens hanging 15 meters ahead. Then, just as smoothly, without a single jolt or sway, the shadow withdrew back into the gap between the pallets. I abruptly switched the display to full screen on channel 3, the rear door from the outside. The light from the exterior camera clearly illuminated the back of the trailer. The heavy steel rod of the alloy lock was in its groove. The red plastic tamper-evident seal, numbered 8819B, was hanging untouched. Beneath the trailer, on the wet, snowy asphalt, lay a smooth, undisturbed blanket of freshly fallen snow. No boot prints. No vehicle nearby. Physical access into the trailer from the outside was absolutely, 100% impossible. I returned to channel 4, the infrared view inside. The aisle was empty. The shadow had vanished from the gap between the 4th and 5th pallets. I needed to be sure. I needed to prove to my heart, which was now hammering against my ribs with a dull, rapid rhythm, that this was just a graphics processor glitch or dead pixels on an IR matrix. On the dashboard to the right of the steering wheel, I have a toggle switch for the trailer's interior service lighting, 2 powerful LED strips that run along the ceiling from front to back, which we use when loading at dark terminals. Without taking my eyes off channel 4 on the monitor, I reached toward the panel and flipped the switch. Click. The video recorder screen blinked. It took the camera a second to deactivate the IR filter and switch from the green and black monochrome mode to full-color daylight. In the bright, flooding white light of the LEDs, the inside of the trailer looked flawless. Clean, shiny, ribbed aluminum floor. Even white cubes of pallets with blue logos. No torn foil. No dangling packing tape. No crushed boxes. And an absolutely empty central aisle from the rear doors to the very front wall. I let out a noisy, relieved breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. "See, you old fool," I muttered aloud in the silence of the cab. Just a matrix glitch when switching off the IR illumination due to a voltage spike in the electrical system. I'll have to check the reefer generator in Denver. I reached out and turned off the trailer lighting switch. Click. The monitor screen plunged into total darkness for 2 seconds while the camera processor recalibrated back to the infrared night mode, turning on the night vision LEDs. The green and black image began to emerge smoothly from the gloom. And when it stabilized, my breath caught in my throat, and an icy vacuum formed in my chest. The 2-meter black shadow was no longer between the 4th and 5th pallets at the rear doors. It was standing right in the middle of the central aisle, but now, between the 10th and 11th pallets. 6 meters closer to the front wall of the trailer. 6 meters closer to me. In the infrared light, I could see its outlines with terrifying clarity. It was not a human body in any familiar sense. The silhouette had no shoulders, the vertical torso transitioned into long, thin limbs pressed to its sides. And the upper part, where the head should have been, was a flat, angular plane, tilted toward the camera lens at an unnatural, broken angle of 45 degrees. The shadow didn't reflect IR light. It absorbed it, looking on the screen like a hole cut into the fabric of space with a knife against the background of glowing white boxes of vaccines. I couldn't move. My fingers froze a few centimeters from the light switch. My rational brain shut down, crushed by the undeniable fact, inside a sealed, airtight trailer at 4 degrees Celsius, there was something physical, and it was moving toward my cab exactly at the moments when the lights in the trailer went out. I sat in the driver's seat, holding my breath, watching what happened on the screen next. Over the next 5 minutes, the shadow in the aisle began to change shape. It didn't walk forward. It began to slowly, with a characteristic, rhythmic pause, extend its side appendages. Long, unnaturally thin strips of shadow detached from the central trunk and reached out to the sides, toward the pallets of medical cargo. I saw on the monitor screen how the white stretch film on the boxes to the right and left of the shadow began to depress inward. The video feed clearly showed deep dents in the plastic from the physical pressure of something hard and heavy pushing against the cargo from both sides, as if the creature was bracing itself in the narrow passage, preparing for a leap or a lunge. And at that moment, outside, through the monotonous hum of the reefer engine, a sound echoed. It didn't come from the monitor speaker, the camera in the trailer didn't have a microphone. It came from behind. Right from behind my back. Thump, thump. The front aluminum wall of my trailer is exactly 40 centimeters from the back wall of the sleeper compartment. In that gap, there are only air hoses and power cables. The sound was coming from right there. From inside the trailer, at the very front end. Thump, scratch scratch scratch, thump. It was as if someone had walked up to the very head of the trailer, pressed against the solid aluminum skin from the inside, and began to slowly, methodically run something hard and jagged against it, right across from the spot where my head had been resting on the pillow 15 minutes earlier. On the monitor screen, the central aisle between the pallets was empty. The shadow was no longer standing between the rows. In the infrared view of the dome camera hanging under the ceiling near the front wall, a large black spot appeared right below the lens, as if the creature had climbed up the wall and was now pressed against the glass of the camera itself, blocking the entire view. The DVR screen filled with fine static, and then a message appeared on Channel 4, video loss. No driver with more than a year of experience would ever get out of the cab with a flashlight in an empty, unlit parking lot when their instincts are screaming about mortal danger. I didn't get dressed. I didn't get out to check the camera connections or look at the seal. In my thermal underwear, I jumped into the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and started the 500 horsepower Volvo engine. I slammed the air brake valves. With a loud, hissing pop, the pads released the drums. Shifting into gear, I tore out of the Wakini rest area at 3:45 a.m., ignoring the freezing rain, the skidding on the ice, and the protesting beep of the ELD recording a severe violation of hours of service regulations. I raced east on I-70 at 70 miles per hour, risking a slide into a ditch on wet bridges, until 40 miles later I saw the life-saving bright lights of the State Way Station and the Kansas Highway Patrol post near Hayes. I roared onto the post grounds, stopped the rig right in front of the weigh-in window, and jumped out of the cab toward the officers on duty. I didn't tell them about the shadows or the sounds, they would have just sent me for a drug test and called psychiatric services. I told the officer that my trailer pressure alarm had gone off and that I had lost the connection to the internal surveillance camera, which, by protocol, required an immediate visual inspection of the cargo in the presence of authorities. 2 Kansas state troopers, in heavy coats and with tactical flashlights, walked with me to the rear gates of the trailer. The abloy padlock was closed. The red plastic numbered seal 8819B was in its place, perfectly intact. We checked the number against the shipping manifest, a 100% match. There were no signs of tampering, filing, or prying on the door hinges. The officer pulled out heavy-duty bolt cutters and snapped the plastic stem of the seal. We turned the locking bars and threw open the heavy doors. From inside, a breath of sterile 4-degree cold wafted out, along with the smell of clean cardboard and a slight scent of ozone from the running Thermo King evaporator. We shone our flashlights inside. All 24 pallets of vaccines were in their places. The stretch film on the boxes was intact. Not a single crate had fallen, not a single box had been opened. But when the young officer aimed the beam of his powerful Streamlight tactical flashlight along the center aisle to the floor of the trailer, he froze and frowned. "Hey, driver, were the forklift guys at the warehouse in Kansas City sober when they loaded you?" I walked to the edge of the trailer and looked where his beam was pointing. The ribbed aluminum floor of a reefer is always covered in the thinnest, barely perceptible layer of condensation frost and aluminum dust. There wasn't a single boot print on that floor. No trace of a forklift driver or a pallet jack operator. But from the very rear doors and all the way across the 15 meters of the central aisle, right up to the front wall of the cargo bay, 2 parallel, continuous tracks of friction marks ran through the frost, each about 20 centimeters wide. It was as if 2 heavy, smooth wooden railroad ties had been slowly dragged along the floor from the doors to the head of the trailer. The tracks ran perfectly straight between the pallets and ended at the front aluminum bulkhead, the very one behind which my sleeping quarters were located. And right where these tracks ended, at a height of 1.5 meters from the floor, a dark, oily smudge was visible on the smooth metal. It looked as if something flat, wide, and heavily smeared with old, decomposed grease had been pressed against the frosted aluminum for a long time. From the smudge came a faint, but distinct, smell of stagnant marsh mud and rotten dampness, which for a second drowned out even the sharp smell of diesel exhaust from the street. "Looks like a pallet with a broken runner was dragged across the whole trailer," the older trooper shrugged, noting the new police seal number in my inspection log. "And you raised a panic. These Chinese wireless cameras are always glitching in the cold, contacts get loose. Get going, don't hold up the way station." I thanked them, closed the doors, attached the new seal, and drove to Denver without stopping, not turning the radio off for a single second, keeping it at full volume. The cargo was accepted without issue, the temperature recorder showed a perfect curve without a single deviation. I didn't quit the company, and I continue to haul reefers. But since that night in Kansas, the first thing I do when I get into the cab before a run is cover the 10-inch surveillance monitor with 4 layers of black duct tape immediately after checking the cargo securement at the warehouse. Because a week after that trip, I took the SD card out of the DVR memory block and opened the video file on my laptop at home, in the daylight. I fast-forwarded the recording to the time I was sleeping in my bunk, 2 hours before the first alarm. On the video, in infrared mode, it was clearly visible that in the silence of the closed trailer, the 2-meter black shadow was already standing pressed against the front wall of the trailer. It wasn't trying to break into the vaccine boxes. It wasn't looking for a way out. It was just standing there, pressing its flat, angular top against the aluminum 10 centimeters from my sleeping head, and slowly, rhythmically rocking back and forth in perfect, second-by-second sync with my own deep breathing in my sleep, which the DVR microphone had picked up through the thin partition of the sleeper compartment. Wyoming at night isn't just a state on a map, it is an absolute, primordial void. There are no familiar roadside services here, no continuous flow of traffic, and not even cell service for stretches covering hundreds of miles. I've been hauling heavy loads on a flatbed for 18 years, and my workhorse is a classic longnose Kenworth W900, equipped with an 18-speed non-synchronized Eaton Fuller transmission and the legendary Cat 3406E engine under its long hood. That night, I was hauling 46,000 pounds of steel drill pipe and casing for oil rigs from Rawlins north toward Casper on U.S. Route 287. The cargo sat in cradles, cinched tight with steel chains, load binders, and 4-inch nylon straps. My gross combined weight was pushing the maximum of 80,000 pounds. U.S. Route 287 between Rawlins and Casper is one of the most desolate and rugged stretches in the entire American Northwest. The highway runs across a high-altitude plateau over 7,000 feet above sea level, cutting through endless salt flats, sagebrush, and windswept basins. Once you pass the city limits around 1 a.m., you immediately enter a total radio dead zone, cell towers are left behind, and the CB radio on Channel 19 falls into a deathly silence. For the next 120 miles, there isn't a single gas station, diner, or town, only a black, frost-heaved ribbon of asphalt stretching into infinity between the dark silhouettes of the rocky ridges. It was 1:30 a.m. The cab was filled with the familiar, rhythmic hum of the diesel engine running at 1500 RPM. A freezing Wyoming wind, gusting at 40 miles per hour, slammed into the left side of the truck, fighting to push the heavy rig off its line and whistling through the brackets of the large side mirrors. My eyes habitually scanned the gauges, oil pressure at 45 psi, coolant temperature in the green, exhaust pyrometer reading normal, and electrical voltage stable. Every 15 seconds, I performed my professional scanning routine: left mirror, windshield, right mirror, dashboard. My rearview mirrors reflected only the red clearance lights of my own flatbed, dimly illuminating the bundles of black steel pipe. Behind me was impenetrable darkness. Not a single car had passed me in the last hour, nor had a single truck passed in the opposite direction. On this highway at night, you are left one-on-one with your machine and your thoughts. Around 1:45 a.m., I began a long, steady climb out of a dry riverbed near Bayroil. The grade was slight, about 3%, but the heavy load forced me to downshift 2 gears into 8th low. My speed dropped to 45 miles per hour, the turbo whistled under the strain as it forced icy mountain air into the intercooler. Taking another look into my left rear-view mirror, I noticed the light of 2 headlamps at the base of the climb, about a quarter mile behind me. My first reaction was relief. Night driving on empty Wyoming highways is exhausting, and the sight of another trucker heading in the same direction always provides peace of mind. I immediately assessed the light pattern of the approaching vehicle. They were large, round halogen headlamps with a warm yellow glow, characteristic of old long-nose rigs like the Peterbilt 359 or the Freightliner FLD produced in the 80s. Above the windshield, on the cab roof, 5 yellow clearance lights burned steadily, arranged in the classic pattern, 3 together in the center and 2 on the edges. I continued to crawl up the grade at 45 miles per hour. Usually, one of 2 things happens on a highway like this: either the truck behind you is lighter and quickly closes the distance to pass in the oncoming lane, or it is even heavier and slowly falls behind on the climb. But for the next 15 miles, as the highway gently rolled over the hills of the Shirley Basin, the distance between us didn't change by a single meter. The trailing truck stayed exactly a quarter mile behind me, about 400 meters. It didn't get closer, and it didn't fall back. Competent driver, I thought, nodding at my reflection in the windshield. Set the cruise control to the same speed and is keeping a safe distance. Deer and elk are constantly darting onto the asphalt out here, and running in pairs is always safer. The lead truck cuts the air and uses high beams, and the second follows quietly in its wake. However, by 2:15 a.m., this perfect distance began to cause me slight unease. On a hilly road, it's impossible to keep a distance accurate to the centimeter for half an hour. When you're on a climb, a heavy vehicle inevitably loses momentum slightly earlier or later than the one behind it. On descents, a truck with a heavy load accelerates faster than a lighter one. But those yellow halogen lights in my left mirror hung there as if glued. I decided to test my theory and let my colleague know that if he wanted to pass, I was ready to yield. Reaching a level, straight stretch of highway, I barely touched the brake pedal, just enough to trigger the brake light switch and light up the red stop lamps on the trailer, but without losing speed. At the same time, I clicked my right turn signal 3 times, the classic trucker signal meaning, "It's clear ahead, feel free to pass on the left." In that same second, the right headlight of the trailing vehicle flashed a yellow turn signal. 3 times. Millisecond for millisecond with my relay. He didn't move to pass. He simply mirrored my light signal perfectly. I frowned. My hand reached for the switch, and I turned off the signal. The light behind me extinguished in perfect sync. I decided to run a physics experiment. Ahead stretched a 10-mile, perfectly flat section of salt flats. I pushed in the clutch, dropped to 6th gear, slammed the throttle, spooling the turbo, and shifted back into 8th high. My Kenworth roared, belching a cloud of hot exhaust into the night, and began to accelerate rapidly, 50, 60, 65 miles per hour. Accelerating a 40-ton rig by 20 miles per hour takes time. The turbo has to spool, the engine has to overcome mass inertia and the resistance of the dense night air. Any vehicle following behind would inevitably lag by several seconds before its driver noticed your acceleration, shifted gears, and stepped on the gas. But the lights in my mirror didn't pull away by even a meter. They didn't fall back while I was shifting gears. They accelerated instantly, with 0 delay, as if we were rigidly connected by an invisible steel cable 400 meters long. My speedometer crept past 70 miles per hour, the lights behind remained in the same spot. Then, I abruptly took my foot off the throttle and engaged the Jake brake to the 3rd, most powerful setting. When the Jake kicks in, the engine turns into a giant compressor, the exhaust valves open at the end of the compression stroke, venting the compressed air energy into the exhaust manifold. A deafening, thunderous roar erupted. Brrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr My speed began to drop rapidly, 60, 50, 40 miles per hour. The vehicle behind slowed at the exact same rate. But in my mirror, above those halogen lamps, no red stop lights illuminated. No trucker can shed 30 miles per hour in 4 seconds without using the service brakes or the engine brake. But if he had engaged his engine brake, would have heard the roar in the night silence from a quarter-mile away. Yet the only sound in the air and on the road was the thunder of my own engine. The trailing vehicle shed speed in defiance of the laws of inertia, without the cab dipping its nose from weight transfer and without closing the distance by even a centimeter. An icy cold, having nothing to do with the temperature in the cab, crawled from my shoulder blades to the nape of my neck. I grabbed the CB microphone hanging overhead. "Hey, truck heading north on 287 behind the flatbed. You copy? Why are you stuck to me like glue? What's going on back there? Over." Only hissing poured from the radio speaker. I switched to channel 17, then to 21, everywhere was empty. I returned to channel 19 and repeated the call, "Truck behind, answer me. You're keeping a distance that isn't human. Over." The mic clicked. A sound came through the speaker. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't radio interference or static. A quiet, perfectly clean acoustic background poured from the speaker, of my own cab. I heard in the speaker the characteristic rattle of the metal clipboard with my bills of lading lying on my right console. I heard the specific, thin whistling of air through the seal of my left window, which I'd been meaning to replace next month. And beneath it all, I heard my own heavy, rapid breathing. Whoever or whatever was broadcasting this signal into the ether wasn't in another vehicle. It was broadcasting sound directly from my own space, reflecting my reality like a perfect mirror. I threw the microphone away as if it were red hot. My heart pounded in my throat, my mouth was parched. My experience screamed, "Do not stop. Under no circumstances turn off the engine in the desert." Ahead, at the 48th mile, a roadwork section began. The Wyoming Department of Transportation was replacing an emergency culvert under the highway. The road narrowed to a single lane, squeezed on both sides by heavy concrete Jersey barriers. To bypass the dug-up section, the road made a sharp, nearly 90-degree S-turn with a speed limit of 20 miles per hour. A single temporary floodlight hung over the work zone, powered by an autonomous diesel generator, illuminating the concrete blocks and yellow plastic barrels in a deathly white light. I began to brake before the narrowing, downshifting, 5th, 4th, 3rd. My long, 28-foot tractor and 53-foot trailer began to slowly roll into the S-curve between the concrete walls. When a rig goes through such a tight curve, a physical phenomenon called articulation occurs. The tractor turns first, and the trailer follows the inner radius, cutting the corner. In the mirror, you always see the side of your trailer brake angle relative to the cab, and the wheels of the dolly pass within centimeters of the concrete blocks. Rounding the first arc of the turn, I didn't take my eyes off the left mirror, waiting for the headlights pursuing me to enter the narrowing behind me. The lights entered the glow of the temporary floodlight. And in that moment, I saw something that my mind refused to process as reality. The vehicle behind did not articulate at the turn. There was no angle of articulation between the cab and the trailer. The two round yellow halogen headlamps, the 5 clearance lights on the roof, and the dark mass behind them entered the 90-degree S-turn as an absolutely rigid, monolithic block. The silhouette didn't lean on its springs from centrifugal force. It moved sideways, parallel to the concrete walls, as if it were a giant 60-foot cube of solid iron sliding on ice on invisible rails, perfectly repeating the trajectory of my own center of gravity. And when this object was under the direct beam of the construction floodlight for a second, I saw what was behind the headlamps. There was no truck. There were no wheels touching the asphalt, no chrome rims, no rotating rubber, no axles. Hanging above the ground at a height of 5 feet was a massive, rusty, matte black tubular frame made of welded channels and I-beams, tracing the outer contours of a long-nosed tractor and flatbed. But inside this frame, it was absolutely empty. There was no engine, no transmission, no cab with a driver's seat and steering wheel. No glass, no chrome. Only 2 burning yellow headlights fixed to the front pipe of the empty frame, and 5 yellow bulbs on top. An empty steel cage, woven from darkness and rusty iron, flew over the asphalt without a single sound of tires, not touching the ground, exactly 400 meters behind my rear bumper. At that moment, the generator at the construction site sputtered, and the only floodlight went out. We were plunged back into the absolute darkness of the high-altitude Wyoming desert. I don't remember how I got through the rest of the repair zone. Animal terror struck my brain, dumping such a dose of adrenaline into my blood that my vision began to darken with tunnel vision. I floored the pedal. My Kenworth surged out of the narrowing, the turbo howling at a maximum 35 psi of boost. I hit 70, 75, 80 miles per hour on the narrow, dark 2-lane road, risking snapping the chains on my load and flying into the rocks at every bump. In the rearview mirrors, the 2 yellow points remained fixed. They didn't fall back by a fraction of a second. Every movement of my steering wheel, every pothole that jolted my suspension, was reflected in the mirror with terrifying, inhuman synchronicity. The cage flew behind me through the salt flats, copying my kinetic rhythm as if it were my own shadow, torn from the asphalt and given mass. This lasted for almost 2 hours. 2 hours of an exhausting race through the dead void of Route 287, under the hissing of the radio broadcasting my own ragged breathing. At 4:10 a.m., a glow finally appeared on the northern horizon. It was the yellow-orange light of the Sinclair oil refinery and the 24-hour truck terminals on the southern outskirts of Casper. As soon as my tractor crossed the city limits and entered the zone of the first powerful sodium streetlights, I glanced in the mirror. The yellow lights behind me didn't slow down or pull onto the shoulder. When the light of the city street lamps fell on the asphalt behind my trailer, they simply extinguished. Not like light bulbs turning off, but like an image disappearing on an old television when the power is cut, they dissolved into the air in a fraction of a second. One moment they were burning my eyes from 400 meters away, and in the next, there was nothing on the empty, frost-covered highway behind me except for the empty road and road signs. I roared into the Sinclair truck stop in Casper, drove into the center of the lot under the brightest floodlight of the fueling zone, pulled the manual brake, and sat there clutching the steering wheel for 30 minutes, unable to stop the violent trembling in my hands and legs. When dawn broke, I climbed out of the cab to check the chain tension on my load. All the binders were tight, the load hadn't moved. I walked behind the flatbed to look at the rear bumper. And what I saw made me take a step back. The entire massive steel rear bumper of my trailer, from the left to the right mud flap, was covered in a thick layer of a strange, gray, velvety dust. It wasn't normal road grime or sand from the salt flats. The dust was dry, incredibly fine, and smelled of burnt bone and welding scale. And right in the center of the bumper, in this layer of gray dust, someone had traced a set of numbers and letters with perfect calligraphic precision. I looked closer and felt nausea rise to my throat. It was my exact license plate number, my US.dot federal number, and the full 17-digit VIN of my Kenworth. At 9 in the morning, sitting in the service area of the Freightliner dealership in Casper, where I'd asked the mechanics to check the suspension after the night's race, I started talking to an old shop foreman, a gray-haired man who had been working with oil field rigs in Wyoming since the late 70s. I didn't tell him all the details, just mentioned that at night on 287, a strange vehicle with yellow lights followed me from Bayroil, perfectly copying my speed and braking, and then vanished at the town entrance. The old mechanic stopped wiping his wrench, looked at me with a heavy, attentive gaze, and said quietly, "You met the shadow rig, son. On Route 287 between Rollins and Muddy Gap. In the winter of '68, when they were widening that road for the oil tankers, 3 drivers in Old Mac's hauling pipe froze to death during a terrible blizzard out on the salt flats. Their trucks were drifted over with snow up to the roof, and they weren't found for a week. The old-timers who run this route regularly say that what's left out on those flats lost its iron, but didn't lose its memory of the run. It wanders the highlands at night looking for a lone trucker running the graveyard shift. It latches onto your clearance lights, catches the rhythm of your transmission, synchronizes with your RPMs, and tries to learn how to be a truck all over again. He paused, looking out the window at the windswept service lot. You're lucky you didn't pull over on the shoulder to check it out with a tire iron. If you stop while it's hanging on your tail in a dead zone, that empty cage pulls your truck into it. It merges with your metal. And by morning, the State Patrol finds a Kenworth idling on the shoulder with the doors locked from the inside, hot coffee in the cup holder, and the logbook open on the seat. But there's no driver, and none of his gear inside the cab. Only a layer of gray, dry dust on the dashboard and steering wheel. I still work in trucking. My Kenworth has over 1 million miles on it now. But I never, for any rate or bonus, take loads through Route 287 at night ever again. And even now, when running on the busy I-80 or I-25, if I notice a pair of round yellow halogen headlamps and 5 roof lights in my left rear-view mirror that maintain a distance of exactly a quarter mile for half an hour, I never touch the brake pedal to blink my lights, and I never reach for the mic. Because I know, as soon as you give a sign that you've noticed its presence, the empty iron cage starts closing the distance. That's all for today. If you've listened to this point, thank you for staying. Before you go, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is for you. I read them to understand who's awake at these hours. It also helps the channel grow and signals to the algorithm that stories like these are interesting. If you liked it, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss new ones. Stay safe. See you in the next video.